Hello, my name is Christian Chialkos, and I'm going to talk today about revisiting the Givenness Hierarchy, a corpus-based evaluation, which is a poster at CODI CRAC at EMNLP-2025 that you also see here on the left side and hopefully in front of you at the moment. Givenness is concerned with the tracking of entities in discourse. So it seems important for human communication for a speaker to be aware of the entities that are supposed to be known, identifiable, or accessible to the hearer, so that he can use the communicative devices to identify them in an unambiguous way, and also to indicate the relevance of referring expressions. There are a number of theories that account for givenness or information status, and one of those is the Givenness Hierarchy. It stands out in the sense that it makes relatively fine-grained predictions regarding the choice of referring expressions, in particular for demonstratives, and this really is a unique aspect. It also has practical relevance in the sense that it's used for language acquisition, and in particular, the demonstratives are important for human-robot communication. It has been applied to a broad array of typologically diverse languages, although almost no data has been published so far. However, it's practically relevant in the sense that it comes with concise annotation guidelines that have been applied to typologically diverse languages and that can be easily operationalized to bootstrap Givenness hierarchy annotations from coreference annotated corpora, and this is what we are going to suggest to do here, because there's almost no annotated data available. And this is a problem because some of the claims of the Givenness hierarchy are actually controversial or have been debated. So, for example, it is not certain that personal pronouns are indeed more salient than demonstrative pronouns, or that demonstrative noun phrases are more salient than definite noun phrases. This has been studied in a number of empirical studies, but these were usually small scale and did not involve statistical significance tests. And this means that some of the results have not been statistically significant, in particular for demonstratives. And this is something that we would like to study. In order to study that, we suggest to replicate the original findings of Gandel et al. For the language that they considered over corpora annotated for coreference, not directly for Givenness hierarchy or another theory of information status. As I said, the coding protocol defines a decision tree that we can use for annotation, and to a large extent, this is based on the form of previous or subsequent mentioned. And this is precisely the information we get from coreference corpora. Also, modern coreference corpora are sufficient in size to expect significant results even for less frequent types of referring expressions, and they are available now for the original set of languages studied by Gandel and colleagues. That is Arabic, English, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Russian, and Spanish. And those are also the languages that are studied in our experiment. The Givenness hierarchy formulates a hierarchy of cognitive statuses ranked from highly given, or in focus, to new but identifiable in type. And this is what they refer to as type. This hierarchy is organized in an implicative way, meaning that higher statuses are subsets of lower statuses. So, if the referent R of that man is familiar, this means that it's also unique, referential, and type identifiable, but it does not necessarily mean that it's in focus or activated. The theory claims that cognitive statuses are lexicalized in the sense that referring expressions indicate the expected cognitive statuses as part of the lexical meaning. So, for example, for a personal pronoun in English, the theory would state that being in focus is actually part of its lexical meaning. However, speakers can deviate from the lexicalized cognitive statuses if they want to express implicit information, and in particular, they can use a lower expression to trigger a quantity implicature. So, for example, when using a definite noun phrase in place of an expected personal pronoun. This has been tested in a number of cross-linguistic annotation studies that support the predicted correlations, and in the original papers they addressed the 7 major languages that I mentioned before. Here are some of the numbers that they report for English. You see here 2 dimensions. One is the inventory of referring expressions they distinguish. The other one is the cognitive statuses that they formulate. And the prediction here would be that everything that is in focus would be expected to be realized as a personal pronoun, but it's possible to deviate in the sense that you can a lower ranking expression. And this is precisely what they find. Similarly, for activated, we find one outlier here with an unstressed personal pronoun. But other than that, all the referring expressions are associated with statuses that are lower than activated. And we find something similar for familiar, and so on. What we do not find, or very rarely, is that we see a referring expression that is actually used for a status that is lower than the status it is associated with. So we don't see personal pronouns for referents that are familiar or unique or referential, for example. While this sounds like support for the theory, if you look at the data precisely, you see that most of the claims that are specific to Givenness hierarchy, that is, in particular, everything they say about demonstrative pronouns, are not statistically significant. So we find confirmation that a personal pronoun is more salient than a definite NP, than an indefinite NP, but that's it. Everything else is not statistically significant. And we try to explore that aspect of the theory and to confirm or verify whether this is actually the case. And to do so, we bootstrap Givenness annotations from coreference annotation. And we can use the coding protocol for that purpose. That defines a strategy that for every referring expression, you check the statuses from the highest to the lowest and then annotate the highest possible status. For every status, they define a number of tests that are defined in terms of context conditions and are mostly independent from the surface form. And every test formulates a criterion that is sufficient for the annotation, which means that if our bootstrapping method fails to capture a specific criterion, it's possible that the predicted status is lower than the actual status, but because the hierarchy is implicative and we operate from highest to lowest, this only means that we lose some degree of precision. We do not actually make an incorrect prediction because the higher statuses are included in the lower statuses. For the annotation of in focus, for example, this is to be done if the referent is subject of the preceding utterance. And we get this from coreference and UD annotations, for example. Or if it's mentioned earlier in the same utterance, and we get this from coreference and sentence splits. Or if it's mentioned in both of the preceding utterances, which we get from coreference and sentence splits. What we do not get from entity coreference is whether it was the event of the preceding utterance or whether it is an inferred discourse topic, but nevertheless, we capture 60% of the criteria. Similarly, for activated, we can check whether the referent is mentioned in in one of the two preceding utterances, and we get this from coreference on sentence splits. Whether it is evoked by a gesture or an eye gaze is not applicable because we work with written texts here. But we cannot tell whether it is a proposition or speech act associated with the preceding utterance. This means that 50% of the applicable criteria can actually be checked by using coreference annotated corpora. For familiar, this is to be annotated if it's previously mentioned, which we get from coreference, or if it's part of the shared background knowledge, which we do not have precise information about. So again, we get 50% of the criteria. Unique is to be annotated if the expression contains sufficient lexical material to create a unique referent. And the question is, what is that? And as our criterion, we said that this needs to be 3 content words or more. Why is that? Well, because that would be a noun phrase with at least 1 adjective or 1 relative clause. And for these, we would assume that this definitely is enough information to create a unique referent. The other criterion is whether the referent is linked by lexical association to an activated referent. The coding protocol doesn't say what they mean by lexical association, but we would assume that the use of a possessive pronoun would be one clear instance of that. And so these two criteria can be heuristically approximated, at least. And we then basically capture all the criteria for that. Referential is to be annotated if the referent is mentioned later in the discourse, which again we get from coreference, or if it's linguistically marked from discourse prominence. And in this case, we actually decided to not use the second criterion because we felt this would be circular. Because if we want to make any observations regarding the form in a particular status, then we cannot take form information into account. Which means that all the context criteria defined here are actually automatically checkable with coreference annotation. Everything else that remains that is annotated for coreference is to be annotated as type, and in particular this includes every single singleton annotated. The bootstrapping by itself gives us now at least 50% coverage for all the tests that are actually applicable. So we are certain to have a number of errors, but because a hierarchy is implicative, this only means a loss in precision, not an actual error. For evaluation, we use 10 corpora in 4 formats. 3 corpora from Ontonotes, 5 corpora from CorefUD, and 2 external corpora for Japanese and Korean. And we used universal dependency annotations for subject detection. This is needed for one of the criteria for being in focus. And if not provided by the source data, these were created on the fly using spaCy or UD-pipe models. Following Gundel, we distinguish up to 11 types of referring expressions per language, exactly for those cases where they were also considered by Gundel et al. And what we find for English then, so here we have a table that is comparable to what we saw from the paper before, with the main difference that now we're talking about tens of thousands of referring expressions, and indeed we find significant correlations basically where we would expect them. The picture becomes a little bit more clear if we look at aggregate results over 4 corpora of English, and the aggregation here is by counting how many significant positive and negative correlations were postulated. Overall, we find that the findings for English support the Givenness hierarchy. There are some exceptions, but these might be artifacts of the bootstrapping heuristics. So, for example, that we find this NP in, that we find this N in familiar might be because these are actually event anaphors, or that we find that, or they might actually be the discourse topic, possibly. That we find AN in unique might be because our heuristic to identify this by the amount of lexical material might just be not very robust. If we find the NPs in type and referential, which Gundel et al. Did never report, might be because our heuristic to identify unique reference is just not sufficiently robust. The only case where we have an actual disagreement with the Givenness hierarchy is that we find that noun phrases inactivated, and this might require some explanation, but in general we see support for the claims of the Givenness hierarchy. Similarly, if we look into non-English corpora, so we have results from 6 corpora. Again, we can confirm the Givenness hierarchy core assumptions for zeros, pronouns, demonstrative, proximal demonstratives, medial demonstratives, for proximal demonstrative noun phrases, and for bare nouns. We see a number of exceptions, in particular the demonstratives we see under type might actually be event anaphors, because none of the corpora that did annotation for that, so they are actually first mentions, if you will, or only mentions. However, we also see that there might be a problem here, because the pattern for distal demonstratives, for medial demonstrative noun phrases and for distal demonstrative noun phrases doesn't look very consistent across those languages. And we wonder whether Givenness might maybe not be the decisive factor here at all. Also, we see that unique, referential, and type don't seem to be good discriminators, and they are neither for English nor for those languages. So maybe these need to be adjusted. In conclusion, the correlations roughly confirm core assumptions of the Givenness hierarchy, and this also serves as a verification of the bootstrapping method. There's one possible exception here, and this is medial and distal demonstrative noun phrases. And we wonder whether it's possible that demonstratives are licensed by the activator status, but that the evidence that indicates that the cognitive statuses of the Givenness hierarchy are maybe not the decisive factor behind the choice of one demonstrative or another. In fact, it's possible, or we would suspect, that these serve other communicative functions as well. It also means that we can induce language-specific Givenness hierarchies from coreference annotations. So, for example, we can use that to extend the Givenness hierarchy to grammatical devices that were not addressed before. And we tried that in a paper, in a case studies for proper names, where we find the expected correlations, which, however, have never been studied on that scale. We can extend the Givenness hierarchy to other languages if we have coreference annotation, and we can explore the role of the Givenness hierarchy in language evaluation, for example, by comparing the Givenness hierarchies of related languages. Also, as the Givenness hierarchy has some technical relevance for human-machine interaction, this means we can support a broader set of languages with that kind of technology. Our findings also give us some impulses for the possible revision and practical application of the Givenness hierarchy. In particular, we see that unique, referential, and type don't differentiate well. There might be two reasons for that. One is referential and type are relatively close to each other in the sense that they don't actually differ in Givenness in the sense of hero-old information, but rather in the speaker's intent. And maybe that involves dimensions that cannot be captured by subsequent mention. We don't know yet. However, another problem is that the identification of unique is heavily heuristic. It might just be ill-defined. However, because unique in the Givenness hierarchy is a subset of referential, it is possible to just abandon unique, because it's ill-defined, in favor of extended referential for future studies. And this extended referential then includes both unique and referential reference. And we can do that very easily because the differentiation between referential and type is clear-cut. So we can just check it by the presence or lack of a subsequent mention in entity coreference. In the longer perspective, we would like to compare our results with manual annotations for the Givenness hierarchy that are in preparation. And we would like to use coreference-based Givenness hierarchy training data to develop an automated coreference-free Givenness tagger. And of course, like to explore the theoretical and practical ramifications, in particular also with comparison to alternative theories of information status. So, for example, it's by no means certain that this is actually categorical. In nature. It might also be a scalar phenomenon. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, then please come to us or contact us later on by email. Thank you very much.